On a summer morning in 1908, the Siberian wilderness awoke to a terror no human language could quite capture. The taiga, so vast, so endless it seemed immune to history, suddenly convulsed. Birds burst in the trees in chaotic flocks. Rivers churned as if boiling, and a silence thicker than prayer hung in the air. Then came the light, a flare so blinding it erased the shadows, turning dawn into something crueler, something wrong. Witnesses miles away spoke a second sun rising, followed by a roar that split the sky apart. Some were thrown from their beds, others pinned to the ground as if by invisible hands. And when it was over, when the heavens stitched themselves close again, an empire held its breath. No city had fallen, no war had broken out. Yet 800 square miles of forest lay shattered, flattened into a spiral of ruin. And at the epicenter, nothing. No crater, no culprit, just a circle of silence where the earth itself seemed scorched by a phantom. What do you call a crime without a weapon? A murder without a body? In Tunguska, the sky itself became suspect, and the questions it left behind still burned hotter than the blast itself. Imagine waking up to find the sky itself screaming. Not thunder, not a storm, but something stranger, an invisible hammer pounding the earth with such violence that windows shattered thousands of miles away. Eyewitnesses claimed the heavens split in two, fire pouring downward like molten glass, followed by a blast wave so strong it knocked entire villages flat. People swore they saw the air ignite. Others described it like the world was ending, that the sun had fallen, and the forests were burning in its place. It was June 30th, 1908, in the heart of Siberia, where the Tunguska River winds through endless taiga. Remote, desolate, the kind of place where whispers take years to reach the rest of the world. Yet on that morning, silence itself became a casualty. Some survivors recalled their livestock vaporized in an instant, gone without a trace. Others swore they saw a column of light brighter than the sun, stretching across the horizon before the shockwave threw them from their feet. One witness, years later, would still insist. The sky opened and fire came out. But here's where it starts to twist. No crater, no impact site, nothing that made sense. When scientists finally clawed their way through swamps and mosquitoes 2 decades later, they found 800 square miles of forest flattened like matchsticks, all pointing outward from some invisible bullseye. And at the center, a dead calm, a void, no meteorite fragments, no smoking hole in the ground, just silence and trees still standing, stripped bare like skeletal monuments. Think about that. An explosion so vast it could have leveled a city, but leaving behind nothing but questions. Was it cosmic? Was it man-made? Was it something else entirely? The Tunguska Event isn't just a natural disaster. It behaves like a crime scene. There's a violence, a destruction, the corpses of trees, but no culprit. And the people who lived through it, who carried scars and stories, became unwilling witnesses to something that still resists explanation over a century later. This is not simply a tale of science. It's a mystery that borders on the criminal. The murder of a landscape, the silencing of an entire region, and a lingering suspicion that what fell from the sky that morning was never meant to be understood. Welcome to Tunguska, the day the earth flinched. Picture Siberia in 1908. It's not the Siberia of prison camps and frozen railways we read about later. It's wilder, raw, like the final draft of a landscape god never finished editing. Endless pine forests stretching to the horizon, rivers coiling like black serpents, and villages so remote that news from Moscow arrived like echoes from another century. The people who lived here weren't city dreamers. They were hunters, trappers, nomads. They relied on instincts sharpened by wolves and winters. Life was silence broken by the occasional howl of wind or the whisper of birch leaves. And into that silence, the Tunguska Event arrived like a scream. But to understand why it mattered, You have to appreciate the world stage at the time. This was the early 20th century. Russia was staggering under the weight of revolution's foreshocks, its empire creaking and splintering. Beyond Siberia, the rest of the world was in the grip of modernity's fever dream. Motor cars, telegraphs, and whispers of flight machines. People believed humanity was striding into a new golden age, where science would finally replace superstition. But Tunguska spat in the face of certainty. Because when the blast thundered across the taiga, no one could report in real time. There was no live coverage, no neat telegrams flashing across Europe. Instead, for weeks, rumors spread like smoke. Peasants whispered of fire demons. Shamans spoke of celestial punishment. And thousands of miles away in London, Paris, and New York, scientists read strange atmospheric reports. Glowing skies, midnight sunsets that turned night into day. They thought it was volcanic dust, or maybe a prank of the aurora. They didn't yet realize they were glimpsing the afterimage of Siberia's catastrophe, its fingerprints smeared across the entire northern hemisphere. Here's the unsettling thing. Had it struck a city, Tunguska would have rewritten history. Imagine London, Berlin, or New York erased in a heartbeat. But because it landed in the world's loneliest wilderness, the devastation went almost unnoticed, like a body dumped in a forest no one visits. That anonymity, that cruel coincidence, helped turn the event into legend. For the locals, though, it was anything but legend. Their homes splintered, their forests burned, their nights glowed with an unholy twilight. They didn't have the luxury of calling it science or myth. To them, it was survival. They were left staring at the sky, waiting for the next blow, not knowing that the rest of the world had barely even noticed they existed. So you've got this backdrop, a forgotten corner of Earth, a fragile empire, a world dazzled by modern science. And into it, something impossible crashes down and leaves behind only silence. There isn't a single human face you can pin to Tunguska. No neat victim's portrait, no suspect sketch in charcoal. Instead, the central figure of this mystery is an absence, a void wrapped in light and violence. Imagine trying to profile a phantom. That's what Tunguska forces us to do. But if we're forced to assign a personality, then the subject becomes a phenomenon itself, the blast that arrived uninvited. And what a character was arrogant, theatrical, cruel. It didn't just flatten trees. It arranged them like dominoes, a radial signature scorched into the earth as if to say, I was here. It didn't just burn the atmosphere. It painted Europe's skies with eerie glowing veils for weeks, like a narcissist demanding an audience. Locals gave it names. Some whisper it was Agdi, the Evenki god of thunder, punishing mortals. Others swore it was a visitation of Agdi, a fire spirit flinging down wrath. But science, in its cold vocabulary, eventually christened it the Tunguska Event, a sterile title for something that behaved like a murderer. And yet, scattered within this ghostly suspect story, there are human witnesses, people who became collateral to its entrance. One man, Semyon Semenov, remembered being hurled from his chair by a wall of heat, so intense it felt like his shirt was aflame. Another hunter described being knocked unconscious by a blast that tore trees around him to splinters, only to wake and find the forest unrecognizable. These men weren't just witnesses. They were survivors of an encounter with something they could never explain. What makes Tunguska unique is how it inverted the usual structure of mystery. Normally, we start with a body and go searching for a culprit. Here, we have a culprit, a violent force, and no body to prove it. No meteorite lodged in the ground. No chunks of iron scattered across the tundra. Just patterns of devastation, and a silence that laughs at explanations. If the event itself is the main character, then the forest became its victim. 80 million trees killed in a single blow, not rotted, not burned to ash, but ripped from their roots and splayed outward in perfect, geometric choreography. Scientists who finally trudged there in the 1920s described it like walking into a cathedral of devastation, an open-air crime scene preserved in wood and ash. So here's the subject: an invisible intruder, large in the city, heavier than 1,000 trains, but vanishing into thin air. The Tunguska Event plays a role of both murderer and missing person, present everywhere in its violence, absent in every attempt to capture it. And that paradox, that absence in the center of horror, is what makes it unforgettable. It began before the blast, before the world was ripped apart. There were omens, strange signals scattered like breadcrumbs across the Siberian wilderness, and the locals noticed. Hunters reported the air felt charged, like invisible lightning crawling over their skin. The Evenki tribe spoke of animals behaving oddly. Reindeer bolted without cause, dogs howling at the treeline as though chased by something they could see, but humans could not. And then came the sound. Witnesses described it like distant artillery, muffled but relentless, rolling through the hills. Remember, this was 1908. Russia was no stranger to the roar of cannon fire. But this wasn't war. This was something deeper, as if the sky itself was groaning under unbearable weight. Then, at around 7:17 in the morning, the first shockwave struck. Not the big one yet. This was the preview, the warning shot. Villagers miles away saw the horizon flare. They said a column of blue-white fire darted across the sky, faster than any bird, brighter than the sun, trailing a tail that split the heavens in two. It seared their eyes like staring into a forge. Some swore they saw the sun falling. Others thought it was the end of time itself. Seconds later came the true impact. Only, again, there was no impact. The explosion detonated high above the earth, suspended in the atmosphere, a phantom weapon with no blade. People were thrown into the air. Homes collapsed, glass shattered into dust. Heat seared skin. The forest ignited. And then silence, except for the ringing in the ears of survivors. Imagine confusion. Imagine waking up in the taiga, your world torn apart, your home leveled, and no enemy in sight. No army. No meteorite in a crater. No physical proof at all. Just devastation. It's the equivalent of finding a stabbed corpse in a locked room, but no knife, no intruder, no footprints. Only the wound. In that first disturbance, the Tunguska Event announced itself like a cosmic assassin, striking from nowhere, striking with precision, and leaving behind a forest-sized riddle. The world would spend the next century arguing over what really happened. But for the people of 1908, there was no debate. The sky itself had turned traitor. Here's where the story turned from disaster to enigma, because destruction is easy to measure. Burned trees, flattened forests, scorched earth. But confusion? Confusion multiplies. And after Tunguska, confusion was the only currency anyone could spend. First, the testimonies clashed like badly tuned instruments. Some witnesses swore the fireball streaked from south to north, while others insisted it tore across the opposite sky. Some claimed two separate explosions, one after the other, while others heard only one, so massive it drowned everything else out. And then there were the details too bizarre to dismiss. Reports of glowing rain, of skies that shimmered with metallic colors, of nights in Europe, so bright you could read a newspaper outdoors at midnight. A catastrophe in Siberia was rewriting sunsets in Paris. But the most damning mystery lay in what wasn't there. No crater, no impact debris, no blackened hunk of cosmic iron buried in the tundra like a smoking gun. Scientists, when they finally clawed their way to the epicenter years later, expected to find the corpse of a meteorite. Instead, they found absence, a circle of devastation radiating outward. But at its heart, trees still standing upright, stripped of branches, pale and ghostly, like witnesses too traumatized to fall. And then there were the stories of sickness. Survivors describe headaches, nausea, sudden weakness. Some animals died outright without burns, without wounds, just collapsed. These reports later became fodder for theories. Radiation, chemicals, invisible poisons from the sky. But in 1908, all they had was fear. Fear and silence. The more people talked, the less sense it made. Was it a comet that vaporized in the atmosphere? A chunk of antimatter colliding with Earth? An alien engine that exploded mid-flight? Every answer created two new questions. And in that vacuum of certainty, the Tunguska Event stopped being just a natural disaster. It mutated into folklore, into conspiracy, into myth. Because when you strip away the rational, the human mind rushes to fill the void. Some Evenki hunters swore they saw fiery gods dueling in the sky. Decades later, Soviet citizens whisper about secret weapons gone wrong, experiments hidden in the wilderness. And the deeper you dig into the accounts, the more it feels less like science, more like a cover-up, or worse, an unsolvable crime with no criminal. It's the silence at the center of Tunguska that drives you mad. The forest screaming in perfect symmetry, the skies glowing across half the world, the absence of a body at the scene of the murder. It's the kind of mystery that doesn't fade with time. It rots in the mind, feeding new fears every generation. When the world finally paid attention, years after the fact, it treated Tunguska not like an act of nature, but like a crime scene waiting for detectives who arrived too late. The man who became its lead investigator was Leonid Kulik, a mineralogist with the stubbornness of a detective chasing a ghost. He convinced the Soviet Academy of Sciences to sponsor an expedition in the late 1920s, nearly 2 decades after the blast. His pitch was pragmatic. If a meteorite had struck Siberia, it must have left valuable metals. Translation: let's go treasure hunting in a wasteland. But when Kulik got there, he found no treasure, only devastation arranged in grotesque geometry. He wrote that walking to the flattened forest was like stepping into a battlefield frozen mid-scream. 80 million trees lying outward in a perfect radial pattern, but no crater at the center. It looked staged, like some cosmic prankster had designed it with a compass and ruler. Kulik, desperate for proof, interviewed locals. Their testimonies were chaotic. Some mentioned a fiery cylinder falling, others a blinding flash, others gods throwing down judgment. Kulik took notes, but what he didn't find haunted him more than all the myths combined. There was no meteorite. Nothing. From that absence, theories multiplied like rats. The scientific mainstream favored the airburst theory, that a comet or asteroid disintegrated in the atmosphere before touching ground, releasing the energy of 1,000 Hiroshima bombs in midair. It explained the radial devastation, the glowing skies, even the absence of a crater. Plausible, neat, elegant. Except neat doesn't match Tunguska's mess. Why no meteor fragments? Why the reports of strange lights, sickness, and multiple fireballs? So the fringe stepped in. Some claimed it was a miniature black hole zipping through Earth like a bullet. Others whispered antimatter colliding with matter. An event so rare it bordered on science fiction. And then came the truly strange. Nikola Tesla's name surfaced. His experimental wireless energy transmissions at Wardenclyffe Tower lined up suspiciously with the Tunguska timeline. Had Tesla tested his death ray across the globe, inadvertently frying a corner of Siberia? Some conspiracy theorists insist yes. And of course, the most enduring shadow, extraterrestrials. A UFO malfunctioning, a reactor core detonating mid-flight, an alien craft tearing itself apart in the sky. The Evenki described it as a God's chariot burning. Replace God with pilot. And suddenly the tale feels uncomfortably modern. But the investigation never delivered closure. Kulik returned from Siberia empty-handed, his health broken by malaria and disappointment. His notes, though, fanned the flames of speculation for the next century, because he proved something chilling. The Tunguska Event didn't behave like any ordinary meteor strike, and in failing to solve it, Kulik transformed Tunguska from catastrophe into myth, from explosion into legend. It's the hallmark of a perfect crime scene, evidence everywhere, answers nowhere. Here's where the Tunguska story fractures, where it stops being a tidy scientific puzzle and becomes a hall of mirrors. Kulik's investigations, heroic though they seemed, didn't just fail to solve the case. They may have poisoned it forever, because when you go looking for a body that isn't there, every discovery starts to feel like madness. Take Kulik himself. He was certain he'd find meteorite fragments buried in the swampy soil. He staked his reputation, his career, on it. But every hole his team dug filled with only muck and silence. No iron, no stone, no answers. His obsession grew feverish, almost pathological. In his diary, he sketched craters that didn't exist. He convinced locals to guide him through mosquito-infested hellscapes, promising a revelation that never came. Imagine Columbo wandering through a crime scene for 20 years, talking to suspects who kept changing their stories, slowly losing faith in fingerprints. That's what Kulik became. And then the Soviet state stepped in. Stalin's Russia didn't like mysteries. Mysteries were dangerous. They invited speculation, dissent, imagination. So the Tunguska Event became both a curiosity and a threat. Official narratives lean on the safe option, a comet or asteroid. Clean, scientific, politically neutral. But under the surface, Soviet whispers multiplied. What if it was a weapons test gone wrong? What if it had been covered up deliberately? What if the truth was buried not under trees, but under red tape? By the 1940s, Tunguska had slipped into folklore. Some Soviet citizens joked nervously that the blast had been God's warning shot, sparing humanity by landing in Siberia instead of Moscow. Others leaned darker. Maybe the explosion was a result of experiments no one was supposed to survive. Think about that. Tunguska as a Russian Roswell, decades before Roswell even existed. The turning point, though, came the way the event stopped belonging to scientists and started belonging to everyone else. Each unanswered question became an opening for myth. Each absence of proof became proof of absence, of cover-ups, of secrets, of horrors too vast for ordinary explanations. And maybe that's the real breakdown. Not the trees, not Kulik's health, not the Soviet suppression. The breakdown was epistemological. Tunguska broke our ability to know. It proved that something could happen on a planetary scale, scar the Earth, and still defy explanation. That's not just unsettling, it's humiliating. It's like the universe playing a cruel joke, reminding us we're still children staring up at the ceiling of the sky, terrified of the noises upstairs. If this were a clean story, here's where we'd hand you the culprit on a silver platter. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it was a comet. Case closed. But Tunguska refuses to play courtroom drama. It's the mystery that sits in the witness box and smirks while the lawyers lose their voices. The official resolution, the one printed in textbooks and trotted out by polite scientists at conferences, goes something like this. A stony asteroid, maybe 60 meters wide, entered the atmosphere at insane speed, disintegrated midair, and released energy equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT. No crater, no fragments, because it never reached the ground. Case dismissed. But does that really settle anything? The airburst model explains the radial devastation, yes, and the glowing skies, yes. But eyewitness accounts of multiple streaks of light, of sickness that lasted for weeks, of magnetic anomalies recorded by primitive instruments. Those details stick out like jagged bones from a too-neat grave. And then there are the outliers, the data points that scientists shuffle into footnotes. Italian researchers in the early 2000s claimed to have found a possible crater hidden under Lake Checo, 8 kilometers from a blast epicenter. Was it coincidence? Or was it the long-buried scar of impact everyone had missed? Others argued that even if Tunguska was just an asteroid, the sheer violence of it, the fact that it struck a wilderness instead of St. Petersburg, was an absurd stroke of luck, cosmic Russian roulette, with humanity in the chamber. And of course, the theories that refuse to die, Tesla's wireless death ray, an alien craft detonation, a fragment of antimatter annihilating itself in our sky. These explanations linger not because they're plausible, but because Tunguska feels too strange for anything ordinary. A rock falling from the sky? Too mundane, too pedestrian. Tunguska behaves like it wants to be myth, not geology. So where does that leave us? With a century of debate and not one definitive answer, the resolution is no resolution. The neat bow tied by science always phrase under scrutiny. The lingering questions remain, multiplying, mutating, demanding to be asked again. And maybe that's the cruelest trick Tunguska ever pulled. It didn't just flatten a forest, it flattened certainty. It left behind a crater not in the earth, but in human knowledge, a hole we still haven't filled. Here's the paradox of Tunguska. Something obliterated 800 square miles of forest, released a shockwave fell across continents, and yet history almost shrugged. Why? Because it happened in Siberia, the world's forgotten attic. No headlines scream catastrophe. No governments collapsed. Humanity, by sheer accident, survived a cosmic uppercut. And so Tunguska became an afterthought, until the shadows it cast refused to fade. The locals carried it like trauma. Even decades later, the Evenki avoided the blast zone, treating it as cursed ground. Hunters whispered of strange lights, of animals avoiding the epicenter. The forest grew back, yes, but unevenly, as though the land itself still flinched at the memory. Globally, though, Tunguska seeped into the bloodstream of culture. Science fiction writers turned it into proof of alien wars fought over Earth's skies. Fringe theorists yoked it to Tesla, Atlantis, even biblical fire from heaven. For every sober journal article, there was a pulp magazine splattering it across lurid covers. The day the Earth was bombed from space. The event became less a disaster than a canvas for fear, imagination, and paranoia. But beneath the myths lay a quieter legacy. Tunguska forced scientists to take near-Earth objects seriously. Before 1908, asteroids were abstract, romantic dots drifting in telescopes. After Tunguska, they were bullets, and Earth was a target. Decades later, this realization evolved into monitoring programs, impact simulations, even planetary defense strategies. You can draw a crooked, trembling line from a flattened taiga to today's asteroid defense task forces. Tunguska was a warning shot. We just took half a century to notice. And yet, the most unnerving legacy isn't scientific. It's psychological. Tunguska proved how fragile we are. One random rock, one unlucky trajectory, and history could be erased before breakfast. The fact that it happened in the wilderness, that we got away with it, only sharpens the dread. Because next time, maybe it's not Siberia. Maybe it's Tokyo, or New York, or you, watching the sky glow brighter than the sun. Tunguska lingers because it's unfinished business, not just for scientists, but for humanity itself. A reminder scratched into the earth that the universe doesn't care about our cities, our progress, our illusions of control. One moment of fire, and all of it can vanish. Here's the part that keeps me awake at night. If you stood at the epicenter today, you'd see a forest healed, green and lush, birdsong filling the air. On the surface, nature has forgiven Tunguska. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. The scars are still there, in the strange growth patterns of trees, in the faint radiation spikes, in the whispered stories of people whose grandparents lived through a sky on fire. And maybe that's the cruelest poetry. The Earth remembers in ways we cannot. We try to file Tunguska Event under meteor, comet, airburst, labels to contain the horror. But what if the truth is bigger, stranger, something we don't have a language for yet? A message in a dialect of destruction we still can't translate? Sometimes I imagine Tunguska wasn't an accident at all, that it was a rehearsal, a demonstration, a cosmic calling card dropped in the middle of nowhere, just to remind us how thin the ice of our existence really is. No crater, because the point wasn't to land, it was to terrify, to whisper, look what I could do if I wanted to. And the legacy of that whisper is still humming. In every asteroid tracking telescope, in every defense program debating if we could really stop a rock the size of a city, in every quiet moment when you look up at the night sky and feel a twinge of unease, as though the stars themselves might be aiming at you, the Tunguska Event isn't just history. It's prophecy disguised as past. The day the universe reminded us we're not the main character, just collateral waiting for the next page to turn. And maybe the final reflection isn't scientific or even rational. Maybe it's just this: sometimes the sky falls and sometimes it doesn't, but it only has to fall once to erase everything we are. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.